The Daniels family car rolled to a stop in front of their new home. A modest but welcoming two-story house tucked into a quiet neighborhood. Amara Daniels pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window. Staring at her new world, she had spent the 5-hour drive oscillating between hope and dread. This city was supposed to be a fresh start, a new chapter, but she couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in her chest. Her mother, Judge Elaine Daniels, stepped out of the car with an air of confidence that Amara admired but could never quite replicate. Elaine was the first African-American woman to be appointed as a Superior Court judge in this district, a monumental achievement that had brought them here. Her father, Marcus, a graphic designer who worked remotely, gave her a reassuring smile as he carried a box labeled, Amara's Books, into the house. It was supposed to feel like an adventure, but all Amara could think about was how much she already missed the familiar hum of her old neighborhood and the friends she'd left behind. The first morning at Springfield High began with Amara clutching the straps of her backpack tightly as she navigated the sprawling campus. The school was bigger than her last one, and overwhelmingly white. The stares came quickly, some curious, some dismissive, and others tinged with something harder to place but unmistakably uncomfortable. In the front office, a cheerful secretary handed her a schedule. "Welcome to Springfield," she chirped, her smile warm but her eyes quickly flitting to the next student in line. Amara didn't miss the way the other students in the office glanced at her and whispered. By the time she found her first class, her nerves were raw. Mr. Matthews' history classroom was a small, cluttered space filled with faded posters of Revolutionary War battles. The man himself, tall and imposing, stood at the front of the room. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room, landing on Amara with a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. "You must be the new student," he said, his voice curt. "Daniels, right? Take a seat." Amara nodded and quickly slid into an empty seat near the back. As she unpacked her notebook, she noticed a boy across the aisle staring at her with open curiosity. She managed a weak smile, but he quickly looked away. The lesson began, and Amara tried to focus, but it quickly became clear that Mr. Matthews had a sharp edge. When he called on her to answer a question about the Civil War, her answer was cut off midway. "That's incorrect," he said sharply. "I expected you to at least know that much." The room fell silent. Amara's cheeks burned as she sank lower into her seat. It was just the first day, she told herself. He probably treated everyone that way. But as the days turned into weeks, it became undeniable that Mr. Matthews' hostility was targeted. He made a habit of calling on her for the hardest questions, interrupting her answers, and making sarcastic comments about her abilities. Once, after a group project presentation, he muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "I suppose effort matters more than accuracy." The other students followed his lead. While most ignored her, some whispered behind her back. A girl in gym class once sneered, "Do they even have schools where you're from?" Amara didn't respond, choosing instead to pour her energy into her studies and her journal, where she wrote about the loneliness that seemed to grow heavier each day. At home, she kept up appearances. Her mother was working long hours, often coming home late from court. Amara didn't want to add to her stress. Her father, ever perceptive, asked her once, "How's school treating you, sweetheart?" She forced a smile and said, "It's fine, Dad, just different." But things were far from fine. One afternoon, after being publicly reprimanded by Mr. Matthews for asking a question he deemed stupid, Amara spent lunch hiding in the bathroom. She cried quietly, feeling a mix of anger and shame. Why did she let him get to her? Why didn't anyone step in? One unexpected ally appeared in the form of Lila, a quiet girl who sat 2 rows ahead in history class. Lila was petite with a shy demeanor but an undeniable kindness in her eyes. One day after class, she lingered by Amara's desk. "That was unfair," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "What?" Amara looked up, startled. "What Mr. Matthews said to you. It wasn't right." Amara was taken aback. She hadn't realized anyone noticed, let alone cared. "Thanks," she murmured, unsure of what else to say. From that day on, Lila would occasionally smile at Amara in the hallways or join her at lunch when she sat alone. While they weren't close friends, Lila's small gestures made a difference, a glimmer of light in an otherwise dark time. But the worst was yet to come. One Friday, Mr. Matthews announced a pop quiz on material they hadn't covered yet. When Amara approached his desk after class to question the fairness of the test, he sneered, "Life isn't fair, Miss Daniels. You'll learn that soon enough." Amara felt the anger rise in her chest. "I'm trying to learn," she said evenly, "but you make it impossible." His face darkened. "Watch your tone, young lady." She turned and left before she could say something she'd regret. But the encounter haunted her all weekend. On Monday, the tension reached a breaking point. During class, Mr. Matthews accused Amara of cheating on a homework assignment. Despite having no evidence, when she protested, he snapped. "Enough," he barked. "You think you're special? That you can break the rules and get away with it? I didn't do anything wrong." Amara shot back, her voice shaking. He slammed his hand on her desk. Leaning in close, "You don't belong here," he hissed. The words hit her like a slap. The class was deathly silent, everyone too stunned or scared to intervene. Amara fought back tears, refusing to let him see her cry. That night, she wrote in her journal until her hand cramped, pouring out all the pain and frustration she had bottled up for weeks. She didn't know how much more she could take, but she resolved not to let Mr. Matthews break her. What she didn't know was that the storm was far from over, and when it hit, it would change everything. Amara sat on the edge of her bed that night, staring at the blank pages of her journal. The words she wanted to write felt trapped, lodged somewhere between the knot in her stomach and the ache in her chest. Outside her window, the city was quiet, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. For a fleeting moment, she wondered what her old friends were doing back home, if they missed her, if they'd forgotten about her already. Her mother's voice drifted up from the kitchen, firm and commanding as she rehearsed her opening statements for a case. Amara used to find comfort in that sound, her mom's voice a constant reminder of justice and strength. But now, it felt like a distant echo. Amara didn't want to worry her. Elaine had enough on her plate adjusting to her new role as a judge in a city that was already scrutinizing her every move. School the next day brought no reprieve. The morning started with whispers in the hallways. As it often did, Amara wasn't naive, she knew what they were saying. Some of the students barely tried to hide their disdain. She'd overheard them in gym class last week, laughing about how she didn't fit the vibe of Springfield High. Another girl had commented, not so subtly, about how affirmative action must be real, even in high schools. But today, it wasn't the students who pushed her to her breaking point. It was Mr. Matthews. The history lesson began like any other, his sharp tone, his disdainful glances. Amara had learned to keep her head down, to avoid drawing his attention. But today, he seemed to be seeking her out, his eyes narrowing every time she shifted in her seat. "Daniels," he barked, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Since you seem so preoccupied, perhaps you'd like to educate the class on the Monroe Doctrine." Amara blinked, caught off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, her heart pounding in her chest. The Monroe Doctrine was a U.S. policy. "Wrong," he interrupted before she could finish. "Clearly, you haven't been paying attention." "I was going to say," she tried again, her voice trembling. "Don't bother." He cut her off, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's obvious you're out of your depth here." The room was silent, all eyes on Amara. She felt the heat rising in her face, the humiliation clawing at her throat. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and never come back. But she didn't. Instead, she clenched her fists under the desk and forced herself to look him in the eye. "I wasn't wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but steady. The room seemed to freeze. For a moment, even Mr. Matthews looked taken aback. Then his face darkened, his lips curling into a sneer. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Amara swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at her to back down. But she couldn't. "Not this time. I wasn't wrong," she repeated, louder this time. "You didn't let me finish." The class collectively held its breath. Mr. Matthews took a step closer to her desk, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "Do you think you're special, Miss Daniels?" he said, his voice cold and cutting. "Do you think the rules don't apply to you? That you can talk back to me and get away with it?" "I just want to be treated fairly," Amara said, her voice shaking now but still firm. "That's all." For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, anger, frustration, maybe even embarrassment, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He slammed his hand down on her desk, making her flinch. You don't get to decide what's fair. He snarled. And you don't get to disrupt my class. Amara didn't say anything. She couldn't. Her heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. She stared at the desk, her vision blurring with unshed tears. The rest of the class sat frozen, too scared to intervene, too complicit to care. When the bell finally rang, Amara bolted from the room, her legs carrying her down the hallway and out the side door of the school. She didn't stop until she reached the far edge of the soccer field, where she collapsed onto the grass. The cool air hit her face, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside her. Why did this keep happening? What had she done to deserve this? All she wanted was to fit in, to learn, to exist without being constantly reminded that she didn't belong. She stayed there for what felt like hours, her thoughts spiraling. She thought about her parents, how proud they were of her, how much they believed in her, how devastated they would be if they knew what she was going through. But she couldn't tell them. She couldn't burden them with her pain, not when they had sacrificed so much to give her a better life. By the time she returned home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the living room. Her father was in the kitchen, humming as he prepared dinner. Her mother was on the phone, her voice calm but assertive as she discussed court proceedings. They looked up as she walked in, their faces lighting up with smiles. "There's my girl," Marcus said, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "How was school?" Amara forced a smile, the light already forming on her lips. "It was fine," she said, her voice steady. "Just a long day." Her mother gave her a knowing look but didn't press. "Go wash up," she said. "Dinner's almost ready." Amara nodded and headed upstairs, her stomach twisting with guilt. She hated lying to them. But what choice did she have? If she told them the truth, it would only make things worse. Her mother would storm into the school, demanding justice, and her father would worry himself sick. And then what? Mr. Matthews would deny everything, and the students would turn on her even more. No, it was better this way. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. She couldn't keep living like this, hiding her pain, pretending everything was okay. She didn't know how or when, but she made a promise to herself. One day, she would make him pay. She would make them all see her, not as a target, not as an outsider, but as someone who deserved to be here, someone who deserved respect. And when that day came, she wouldn't hold back. Monday mornings were never easy. But for Amara, this one felt heavier than usual. The weekend had given her too much time to think. She'd replayed the moment with Mr. Matthews over and over in her head, analyzing every word, every glare, no matter how much she tried to push it aside. His voice lingered like a storm cloud. "You don't belong here." The walk to history class felt longer than usual, the hallways more suffocating. When she stepped into the room, Mr. Matthews barely glanced at her, his cold demeanor a stark reminder of the power he wielded over her. Amara sat in silence as he began the lecture, her notebook open but untouched. The words he spoke blurred together, drowned out by the pounding of her heart. "Daniels," he said suddenly, snapping her back to reality. His voice was sharp, his expression hard. "Care to enlighten the class on what President Jackson's policies meant for the Native American population?" Amara hesitated, unsure if it was a genuine question or another trap. "They led to the Trail of Tears," she said cautiously. "The forced removal of Native Americans." "Wrong," he interrupted, his tone laced with disdain. "Try again." "But," Amara started, her voice faltering. "I said try again," he barked, cutting her off. The class shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Amara and Mr. Matthews. She could feel their silent judgment, their relief that they weren't the ones being singled out. "I don't know what you want me to say," she admitted finally, her voice trembling. "Of course, you don't," he said with a sneer. "Why should I expect you to understand complex historical concepts when you can't even manage basic comprehension?" The words hit her like a slap. Amara stared at her desk, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but the weight of his words and the suffocating silence of the class left her paralyzed. For the rest of the day, Amara moved through her classes like a ghost, her mind replaying the humiliation over and over again. She avoided Lila at lunch, not wanting to face the pity in her friend's eyes. By the time the final bell rang, she felt drained, her body heavy with exhaustion. But the worst was yet to come. That afternoon, Amara stayed behind in the library to work on an essay. The quiet hum of the space offered a temporary refuge from the chaos of her thoughts. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice the footsteps approaching until it was too late. Daniels. Mr. Matthews' voice broke the silence, making her jump. She turned to see him standing at the end of the aisle. His expression cold and unreadable. "Yes?" she said cautiously, her fingers tightening around her pen. "Come with me," he said curtly, motioning for her to follow. Amara hesitated but ultimately obeyed, her heart pounding as she trailed behind him. He led her to an empty classroom, the door clicking shut behind them. The sound sent a shiver down her spine. "I don't appreciate being disrespected in my own class," he began, his voice low and dangerous. "I wasn't trying to," she started. But he cut her off. "Don't interrupt me," he snapped, his face inches from hers. "You think you're clever, don't you? Trying to undermine my authority. Make me look like the bad guy." "That's not what I was doing," Amara said, her voice shaking. Enough," he roared, slamming his hand on the desk beside her. She flinched, her body instinctively recoiling. "I don't care what excuses you have. You're nothing but a disruption, a problem that this school doesn't need." Amara felt the tears welling up, but she refused to let them fall. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Why do you hate me so much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, he seemed taken aback, his expression faltering, but then his sneer returned, colder than ever. "You don't belong here," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You never have, and you never will." The words cut deeper than she thought possible. Amara stared at him, her chest tight with a mix of anger and despair. She wanted to fight back, to scream at him, but the weight of his hatred left her speechless. When she finally left the classroom, her body felt like it was moving on autopilot. She barely remembered the walk home, her mind consumed by the encounter. By the time she reached her house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the front yard. Her parents were in the living room, their voices soft and filled with laughter as they watched a sitcom. Amara stood in the doorway, her eyes burning with tears she couldn't hold back any longer. Her father noticed her first, his smile fading as he stood up. "Amara?" he said, concern etched across his face. "What's wrong?" She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she let out a choked sob, her body trembling as the weight of everything she'd been holding in finally broke free. Her mother was by her side in an instant, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Baby, what happened?" she asked, her voice firm but gentle. For the first time, Amara told them everything. She told them about the stares, the whispers, the snide comments from her classmates. She told them about Mr. Matthews, his cruel words, his humiliating behavior, and the way he made her feel small and powerless. She told them about the incident in the library, the way he'd looked at her, the hatred in his voice. By the time she finished, her parents were silent, their faces a mix of anger and heartbreak. Her mother's hands were clenched into fists, her jaw tight with rage. "This man hurt my daughter," she said finally, her voice trembling with fury. "He humiliated her, belittled her, made her feel like she was less than human. And he thinks he can get away with it? He won't," Marcus said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We won't let him." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Judge Daniels threw herself into action, using every resource at her disposal to gather evidence against Mr. Matthews. She spoke to Amara's classmates, finding a few brave enough to share their experiences. Lila stepped forward, recounting the cruel things she'd seen him say and do. Surveillance footage from the school showed him slamming his hand on Amara's desk, his face twisted with rage. The case against him grew stronger with each passing day. But so did the tension. Mr. Matthews caught wind of the investigation and began spreading rumors, painting himself as the victim of a witch hunt. Some teachers and students rallied behind him, convinced that he was being unfairly targeted. But Amara's parents didn't back down. They knew the truth, and they were determined to make sure everyone else did too. For Amara, the process was both empowering and terrifying. She was no longer alone in her fight, but the weight of her story being made public was overwhelming. She feared the backlash, the whispers, the judgment, but she also felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that told her she was finally being heard. The confrontation was far from over, but for the first time, Amara felt like she had a chance. And she wasn't going to let it slip away. The silence in the Daniels household that evening was deafening. Amara's parents sat across from her at the kitchen table. Their faces a mixture of fury and heartbreak. Elaine Daniels, usually so composed and commanding, looked as if the weight of the world had been placed on her shoulders. Marcus, ever the steady presence, rubbed his temples as though trying to process the storm that had just hit their family. Amara sat quietly, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. She had finally told them everything: the insults, the unfair grades, the humiliation, and Mr. Matthews' terrifying outburst in the empty classroom. The room felt heavy with the unspoken question hanging in the air. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Elaine broke the silence first, her voice steady but low. Amara, do you understand how serious this is? This isn't just a teacher being strict or tough. What he's doing is abusive. It's criminal. Amara nodded, tears threatening to spill again. I didn't want to worry you, she admitted. You've both been so busy. And I thought I could handle it. Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to handle this alone, sweetheart. That's why we're here. You're our daughter. It's our job to protect you. Elaine's hands tightened into fists on the table. This man thinks he can bully and intimidate you because he assumes no one will stand up to him. He doesn't know who he's dealing with. There was steel in her voice now, the tone she used in the courtroom when delivering a particularly damning argument. Amara had always admired her mother's strength, but seeing it directed so fiercely at her defense made her feel a flicker of hope amid the fear. What do we do now? Amara asked, her voice small. Elaine looked at Marcus, and they exchanged a silent agreement. First, she said, we gather evidence, everything you've told us, every moment of his mistreatment. We're going to document it. Every insult, every unfair grade, every incident where he crossed the line. Marcus nodded. And we'll talk to the school. There have to be other students or teachers who've seen or heard something. We'll find them. But what if no one believes me? Amara asked, her voice trembling. What if they take his side? Elaine reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand in hers. We'll make them believe you, she said firmly. This isn't just your fight anymore. It's ours. The next day, Elaine and Marcus met with the school principal, Mr. Andrews, a mild-mannered man who seemed more concerned about avoiding conflict than addressing the seriousness of their claims. When they outlined the allegations against Mr. Matthews, his face paled, but he quickly tried to deflect. Mr. Matthews has been with us for over 20 years, he said. He's a bit old-fashioned in his methods, but he's a respected member of the faculty. Respected? Elaine's voice was sharp. He verbally abuses students. He physically intimidated my daughter. And you're telling me that's acceptable because of his tenure? Mr. Andrews shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We take all allegations seriously, Mrs. Daniels, but without concrete evidence, it's difficult to take disciplinary action. Elaine's eyes narrowed. You'll have your evidence, she said, and when you do, I expect immediate action. If not, we'll take this beyond the school board. Do I make myself clear? The principal nodded, but his hesitation left a bitter taste in Amara's mouth. She had hoped for someone to finally stand up for her, but it was clear that wouldn't happen without a fight. At school, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Word had spread about the Daniels family's complaint, and it wasn't long before whispers followed Amara wherever she went. Some students avoided her altogether, afraid of being dragged into the conflict. Others were less subtle, making snide comments when they passed her in the halls. Snitch, one boy muttered under his breath. Just wants attention, a girl said loudly to her friend. Amara kept her head down, her shoulders stiff, but inside, her anger burned. It wasn't just Mr. Matthews anymore, it was the entire culture of the school. The unspoken code that allowed people like him to thrive while silencing anyone who dared to speak out. But not everyone was against her. Lila, her quiet but steadfast ally, stood by her side. Don't listen to them, she said one day during lunch. They're just scared. They don't want to admit that he's been awful because it's easier to ignore it. Amara looked at her friend, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, she said, for believing me. You're brave, Lila replied, braver than I could ever be. The turning point came a week later when Marcus managed to retrieve footage from a security camera in the history classroom. The video showed Mr. Matthews towering over Amara's desk, his hand slamming down hard enough to make her flinch. While the audio wasn't clear, His body language was unmistakably aggressive. Elaine watched the footage with a grim expression. "This is enough to get him removed," she said, "but we're not stopping here." Amara's classmates began to come forward, emboldened by the Daniels family's determination. Lila gave a heartfelt statement about the things she had witnessed. From Mr. Matthews' unfair grading to his public humiliation of Amara. Another student admitted to hearing him make a racist remark about her in the teacher's lounge. The case against him was growing stronger. But so was the backlash. Some parents accused Elaine of trying to ruin a good teacher's career. Anonymous notes were left in their mailbox, calling her a troublemaker and worse. Amara's resolve wavered under the weight of it all. But every time she thought about backing down, she remembered the look on Mr. Matthews' face when he told her she didn't belong. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every student who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The final confrontation came when Mr. Matthews was called into a formal hearing. Elaine presented the evidence with the precision and confidence of a seasoned attorney. Her voice unwavering as she laid out the case against him. Amara watched from the back of the room, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. When it was Mr. Matthews' turn to speak, he tried to paint himself as the victim of a smear campaign. "I've dedicated my life to teaching," he said, his voice heavy with feigned emotion. "This is an attack on my character, my reputation." But his facade cracked when the footage was played, followed by the testimonies of Amara and her classmates. The room fell silent as his true nature was laid bare. When the hearing concluded, the decision was swift. Mr. Matthews was terminated from his position, and the case was referred to law enforcement for further investigation. The relief Amara felt was overwhelming. But it was bittersweet. The damage he had done couldn't be undone. But at least he could no longer harm anyone else. As she walked out of the building with her parents, the weight she had been carrying for months finally began to lift. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe again. But this wasn't the end. Amara knew there was still work to be done, to heal, to rebuild, and to make sure no one else had to endure what she had. And she was ready for it. The day of the trial arrived with an air of anticipation that hung thick over the city. The courtroom was packed with reporters, teachers, students, and community members, all eager to witness the case that had become a lightning rod for discussions about race, power, and justice. Amara sat in the front row with her parents, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart raced as she glanced toward the defendant's table, where Mr. Matthews sat with his lawyer, his face stony and defiant. Judge Daniels had recused herself from the case, citing a conflict of interest, but her reputation as a fair and thorough arbiter loomed large over the proceedings. The presiding judge, a stern but impartial woman named Judge Rowe, opened the trial with a warning to the gallery about maintaining decorum. "This case is about truth," she said firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less." The prosecution wasted no time laying out the allegations against Mr. Matthews. They called witnesses who described his pattern of abusive behavior, painting a picture of a man who had long used his position to bully and belittle students, particularly those who didn't fit his narrow view of who belonged. Amara was the first witness called to the stand. Her stomach churned as she took the oath, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her. As she began to recount her experiences, her voice wavered at first, but she found strength in the quiet encouragement of her parents and the memory of everything she had endured. She described the cruel remarks, the public humiliations, and the final confrontation in the classroom. "He told me I didn't belong," she said, her voice steady now. "He wanted me to feel small, to believe that I wasn't good enough. But I am, and no one should have to go through what I did." When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, the questions were sharp and probing. They tried to paint her as overly sensitive, as someone who had misconstrued Mr. Matthews' actions. But Amara held her ground, her responses clear and unwavering. Each attempt to discredit her only seemed to strengthen her resolve. The courtroom was silent as she stepped down from the stand, her testimony ringing in the air like a bell. Elaine reached for her hand as she returned to her seat, squeezing it tightly. "You did so well," her mother whispered. "I'm so proud of you." The prosecution then called other witnesses, including Lila, whose testimony was particularly moving. "I saw how he treated her," Lila said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He singled her out, over and over again, and I didn't say anything because I was scared. But I'm not scared anymore." Other students followed, some reluctantly but honestly recounting the moments they had witnessed. A teacher came forward, admitting to hearing Mr. Matthews use derogatory language in the staff room but feeling powerless to speak out. Each story built upon the last, weaving a damning narrative that was impossible to ignore. But the most compelling evidence came in the form of the security footage. The grainy video showed Mr. Matthews slamming his hand on Amara's desk. His face contorted with rage. Though the audio was faint, his body language was unmistakably aggressive. The footage played on a loop in the courtroom, a stark reminder of his unchecked hostility. The defense tried to mount a counter-narrative, portraying Mr. Matthews as a strict but fair teacher who had been misunderstood. They called a handful of his former students who spoke glowingly of his dedication. But their testimony felt hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence against him. When Mr. Matthews finally took the stand, his demeanor was a mix of indignation and self-pity. He denied the allegations, claiming that his actions had been taken out of context. "I've always held my students to high standards," he said. "Perhaps some didn't appreciate my methods, but my intentions were never malicious." But his composure cracked under cross-examination. When pressed about specific incidents, his responses grew defensive and inconsistent. The prosecution played excerpts of his recorded interactions with Amara, juxtaposing them with his earlier claims of fairness. By the time he stepped down, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that his story didn't hold up. The closing arguments were impassioned. The prosecution spoke about the responsibility teachers have to nurture and protect their students, not demean or harm them. They emphasized the courage it took for Amara and others to come forward, highlighting the broader implications of the case. "This is not just about one teacher or one student," the prosecutor said. "It's about ensuring that our schools are safe spaces for everyone, regardless of their race, background, or identity. We cannot allow those in positions of power to abuse it without consequence." The defense, meanwhile, tried to appeal to sympathy, arguing that Mr. Matthews had been unfairly targeted and that his years of service should not be overshadowed by a single complaint. But their argument felt weak, overshadowed by the mountain of evidence against him. When the jury returned with their verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. Amara held her breath, her hands clutching the edges of her seat. The foreperson stood, clearing their throat before delivering the words that would change everything. "We find the defendant, Mr. Matthews, guilty of all charges." The room erupted in whispers, a mix of relief and outrage. Mr. Matthews' face remained impassive, but his shoulders sagged as the weight of the verdict settled on him. The judge ordered him taken into custody pending sentencing, and as he was led away, he cast a final, defiant glance at Amara. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression calm and resolute. In the days that followed, the trial became a catalyst for change. The school district implemented new policies to address discrimination and harassment, mandating training for staff and creating a more robust system for reporting misconduct. Students who had once stayed silent began to speak out about their own experiences, inspired by Amara's bravery. For Amara, the victory was bittersweet. While she was grateful for the justice she had fought so hard to achieve, the scars left by Mr. Matthews' actions would take time to heal. But she didn't face the journey alone. Her parents stood by her every step of the way, their unwavering support a constant source of strength. Lila remained a steadfast friend, their bond deepened by everything they had endured together. As the months passed, Amara found herself growing stronger. She joined a student-led initiative to promote inclusivity at the school, using her voice to advocate for others who felt marginalized. Her journal, once a repository for her pain, became a space for hope and determination. One evening, as she stood on stage at a community event, she spoke about her journey. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone," she said, her voice clear and confident. "But I've learned that change starts with courage, with the willingness to speak up, even when it's hard." The crowd erupted into applause. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Amara felt truly seen, not as a victim, but as a survivor, a leader, and a force for change. And in that moment, she knew she had reclaimed her power. The air in the courtroom was electric as the jury delivered its verdict. The words, "guilty on all charges," echoed in Amara's mind, a resounding confirmation of everything she had endured. As the bailiff moved to escort Mr. Matthews out of the courtroom, his eyes briefly met Amara's. His usual air of arrogance was gone, replaced by something colder, angrier, a bitterness that sent a chill down her spine. But Amara didn't look away. She held his gaze, refusing to let him see an ounce of fear. When the gavel struck to end the proceedings, Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, and her father wrapped an arm around her. "It's over," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with relief and pride. "You did it, sweetheart." Elaine nodded. "No, we did it," she corrected, her tone firm but warm. This was a fight none of us could have won alone. For Amara, the verdict wasn't just a win against Mr. Matthews. It was a victory against the systemic culture of silence and complicity that had enabled him for so long. But as the crowd began to file out of the courtroom, the weight of what came next loomed large. Justice had been served, but the journey toward healing was only beginning. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions. Amara became an unexpected symbol of resilience in her community. News outlets covered the case extensively, shining a light on issues of racism and abuse in schools. While some hailed Amara as a hero, others criticized her for ruining a teacher's career. The mixed reactions weighed on her, but the support she received from her family, friends, and many strangers kept her steady. At school, things were different. Mr. Matthews' absence left a noticeable void in the faculty, and while some students seemed relieved, others whispered in hushed tones about the controversy. Amara felt the stares whenever she walked down the hallways, some curious, others judgmental, but there was also a shift. A growing number of students began standing up for her, offering words of encouragement or quiet nods of support. One day, during lunch, a boy named Ethan, who had never spoken to her before, approached her table. "Hey, Amara," he began awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say, what you did was really brave. I'm sorry I didn't say anything before. I should have." Amara looked up, surprised but grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. "It means a lot." Encounters like this became more common. And slowly, Amara started to feel like she wasn't as alone as she had once thought. But the process of rebuilding her confidence and sense of safety was far from easy. At home, Elaine was relentless in her mission to ensure that no other child would suffer the way Amara had. She worked closely with the school board to implement new policies aimed at preventing abuse and discrimination. These included mandatory diversity training for staff, a more transparent process for reporting misconduct, and regular student feedback surveys. Amara, meanwhile, was invited to share her story at community forums and school assemblies. The first time she stood in front of a packed auditorium, her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone. But as she began to speak, her nerves faded, replaced by a sense of purpose. "I used to think that staying quiet would protect me," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I thought that if I just kept my head down, it would all go away. But silence doesn't solve anything, it only lets the pain fester. Speaking up was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most powerful." Her words were met with thunderous applause. And afterward, several students approached her to share their own stories of facing adversity. Each conversation reinforced her belief that change was possible, but it required courage and solidarity. The sentencing hearing for Mr. Matthews brought another wave of emotion. Elaine had warned Amara that it might be difficult to hear the defense plead for leniency, arguing that he had already suffered enough with the loss of his career and reputation. But the prosecution's arguments were compelling, emphasizing the long-term harm he had caused not just to Amara, but to countless other students over the years. When Judge Rowe delivered the sentence, 5 years in prison with no chance of parole, Amara felt a mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. As Mr. Matthews was led out of the courtroom, she hoped he understood the weight of what he had done, though she doubted he ever would. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Amara found solace in writing, filling her journal with thoughts not just of pain, but of hope and resilience. She also threw herself into her schoolwork, determined to reclaim the sense of accomplishment that Mr. Matthews had tried to steal from her. One afternoon, Lila invited her to join the student-led diversity committee, a group formed in the wake of the trial to foster inclusivity and promote understanding. Amara hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to take on another responsibility. But when she attended her first meeting and saw how passionate the other students were, She knew she had found a place where her voice could make a difference. "We want to organize a cultural festival," Lila explained, her eyes alight with excitement. "A way to celebrate everyone's backgrounds and show that diversity is our strength." Amara smiled, feeling a spark of hope she hadn't felt in months. "I'd love to help," she said, and for the first time in a long time, she meant it. The festival became a turning point for the school. Students and teachers came together to share food, music, art, and stories from their cultures. Amara volunteered to run a booth showcasing African American history and literature. And the response was overwhelming. People stopped to ask questions, to learn, and to connect in ways that felt genuine and transformative. As she watched the crowd that day, Amara felt a sense of pride that went beyond personal accomplishment. She realized that her struggle had sparked something bigger than herself, a movement toward understanding and acceptance. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there was still so much work to be done, but it was a start. Months later, Amara stood in the same courtroom where her trial had unfolded, this time as a guest speaker for a youth leadership program. She spoke about her journey, the challenges she had faced, and the lessons she had learned. "Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid," she told the young audience. "It means you act anyway. Because some things are worth fighting for." Her words were met with applause. But what stayed with her most were the quiet conversations that followed. Students approached her with stories of their own struggles, seeking advice or simply thanking her for inspiring them. Each interaction reminded her of the power of her voice and the responsibility that came with it. As Amara left the courtroom that day, the sun shining brightly overhead, she felt a sense of closure. The wounds Mr. Matthews had inflicted might never fully disappear, but they no longer defined her. She had taken that pain and turned it into strength, using it to build something lasting and meaningful. And as she walked forward, her head held high, she knew she was no longer just a survivor. She was a force for change, and nothing could take that away from her.